Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Megan Kate Nelson. Megan is a writer and a historian. She writes about the Civil War, U.S. Western history, and American culture. She has written several books, and today is a very important day for her and her book. We will speak about her latest book, Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. Megan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So I'm super excited. Today is the publication of your book, Saving Yellowstone. We will speak about that in a minute. But before we get there, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, how is it that you got interested in history and now you are a full-time writer? Just tell us a little bit about the series of steps that took you there.
Sure, of course. I think I started to really love history and landscapes, American landscapes, when I started taking those annual summer vacations with my family. My mother didn't like to fly, so we always went by car. And so we would visit, all kinds of things, historical sites, national parks, cities, amusement parks, all along the way over 2 weeks in the summer, every summer when I was a kid. And I got to sit in the car and hold the map and direct my father. This is way back in the days before GPS and online mapping. And so I really got to know the American landscape and its history by traveling through it. And so I had always loved that experience. And I think that's what really drew me to environmental history when I got to college and to graduate school. And first, I started writing about the American South. I wrote a book about swamps. And then I got sucked into the American Civil War, which for Americanists, is this major field of history. And it's so rich, and the experiences there are so amazing to delve into that it sucks you in. And so I stayed there for my second book, but I went west with that. The Three-Cornered War told the story of the Civil War from the desert Southwest. And once I went back to the West, I'm from Colorado originally. And so have always loved the West, still consider myself a Westerner, even though I haven't lived there in years, but still consider it home. And so while I was researching that book, I had started looking into the history of surveys and surveying, and I realized that this Ferdinand Hayden expedition to Yellowstone was coming up on its 150th anniversary, and the Yellowstone Act. And this really appealed to me as a writer and a historian, and someone who's really interested in thinking about and talking about landscapes, and especially iconic landscapes, and also slightly strange landscapes in North America. And really also reckon that anniversaries are important times for us to really reconsider a moment, or think about it and why it became important.
From what I understand, you live in Colorado, or your family live in Colorado, and from there, your family will travel to different points of the country. Is that right?
That is right. Every summer we would go on these vacations and visit historic sites and national parks and amusement parks and cities and see all the sites that there were to see. And so that really shaped me as a historian. I kind of gained my love for history while I was gaining a love for the American landscape and landscapes all across the country.
And he said that it will be the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone Park, the thing that inspired you to write this book about the history of Yellowstone?
It really did. I was doing some research for my previous book in surveying and surveyors in American history, and realized that Ferdinand Hayden's scientific expedition of Yellowstone was coming up on its 150th anniversary, and that it led directly to the Yellowstone Act, which created the first national park in the world, whose anniversary is today, 150th anniversary. So happy birthday, happy 150th birthday, Yellowstone National Park.
It's not like Yellowstone didn't exist before. I
Right.
guess that's the
Right.
time that the white men decided to sign this act declaring the nascence of Yellowstone Park. Is that right?
That is exactly right. Indigenous peoples had known about Yellowstone and traveled through it and hunted in it and camped in it for thousands of years before 1872. So, but for a lot of different reasons, partly due to its inaccessibility, white Americans had not really been in Yellowstone very much by 1871. So in that moment, it was one of the last unmapped places in the country.
Okay, so for the millions of people like me who has never been in Yellowstone, can you describe what is there to see? Why is it so important to history? What's the fauna like? And I mean, I just went through Google images and I saw some mind-blowing, beautiful pictures. But yes, because this is an audio podcast, can you tell us what is it
Yes.
like?
Absolutely. So if your listeners can just imagine an area of land that is larger than the state of Rhode Island, over 2 million acres. And Yellowstone is situated in northwestern Wyoming. It has bits and pieces of Idaho and Montana. And it's roughly organized into two different parts. Western Yellowstone has the majority of the geothermal features, the geysers, the boiling springs, the obsidian cliff made of glass, and Mammoth Hot Springs, which is this enormous structure of hot water pools and calcified rock. And then on the eastern side, there are the valleys, the Hayden Valley and Lamar Valley, where all the what we call charismatic megafauna are wolves, bears, elk, all the wildlife that you go to see, the bison in particular in Yellowstone, are almost all on the eastern side. And the Yellowstone River, Yellowstone Lake, and then also the two great falls of the Yellowstone into the canyon are on that side. So it's got really a bunch of different kinds of really cool geological features. And it's really the geothermal region that is the most unique in all the world. Because, I mean, there are lots of places with mountains and beautiful waterfalls, right? But the Yellowstone's, I think it's thousands and thousands, even more than 10,000 geothermal features that's the largest collection of them in the world. Absolutely unique.
Geyser, I saw one. I went to Iceland and I was just incredible that the water would spit out like that. Can you describe for someone who has never seen a geyser, what is a geyser?
Sure. Yes. So this is a really interesting feature. And what happens is the reason that Yellowstone exists the way it does is that it sits on top of a caldera, or what we now refer to as a supervolcano. So that, the Earth's kind of molten magma is very close to the surface in this region. And the landscape has created all of these really interesting different kinds of networks of tunnels. And I think scientists refer to it really as plumbing. And when rainwater and groundwater seeps in there, it heats up from the magma and it creates steam and it builds all this pressure. So at certain points, it just shoves it straight up out through the surface of the earth and into the air. And sometimes these geysers are really regular. So Old Faithful, which is probably the most popular geyser site in all of Yellowstone, erupts now, I think, around every 90 minutes. Wow. And others are a little more irregular. They can go for a couple of years between eruptions. But yeah, they start hissing and you can tell that they're there and the steam is rising and it's kind of bubbling. And then suddenly all this water will start jetting up out of the ground, and you don't want to be too close when that happens, because it is superheated. Yes.
And why is it called Yellowstone?
It's called Yellowstone. This was actually a translation of a term that Native peoples had given the river. One of the rivers that comes out of Yellowstone Basin is the Yellowstone River, and it kind of moves north and then east through Montana and meets up with the Missouri, which then meets up with the Mississippi. And along that river course, there were yellow rocks that were turned that color by sulfur. And the indigenous peoples in the area called that river by a name that meant that the French traders who were there translated into Yellowstone. Wow. So that is how the river got its name. And so the basin has taken its name from that river.
Okay, so the subtitle of the book is Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. So what was going on in America at that time in history?
Yeah, this was one of my major questions when I went to write the book, because when I realized it was going to be the 150th anniversary coming up, I also realized that this first scientific expedition and the Yellowstone Act happened right in the middle of Reconstruction, which in America is the period right after the Civil War in which the country is trying to come back together. So the US Congress is trying to bring all the states of the former Confederacy back into the Union after their Great Rebellion and their attempt to separate from the United States. The economy was pretty unstable, and culturally, Americans were really looking for something that would unify them, that would give them something to believe in, right? And to rally around and to really believe in America again as a country that had potential after this incredibly divisive and destructive Civil War. So in 1871, Congress gave Ferdinand Hayden $40,000 to go and explore Yellowstone, to find out what was there, to see if the rumors about this place were true, and to inform Congress about it. And it was one of the efforts that the US Congress was making in this period to bring the West back into the Union. So really, the overarching argument of the book is that when we look at Reconstruction from Yellowstone, we see Reconstruction not as only a political effort to bring the South back into the Union, but also an effort to bring the West into the Union as well, and to give people a sense that their country was really unique and special and exceptional in all the world.
So you mentioned a few times already Ferdinand Hayden. Who was he?
He's such an interesting character. So he's one of the three protagonists in the book. He grew up in poverty, a child of divorce. He was very smart. His family figured that out and managed to send him to Oberlin College, where he studied the sciences, and he got really interested in geology and in that science, and discovered, interestingly, that he had a talent for fossil collecting. And you wouldn't think that that's something that you would have a talent in, but it actually takes a lot of skill to be able to look at rock and see fossils there and understand how important they are to understanding how old the earth is, how animals have evolved, all of these scientific questions that are going around in the mid-19th century. And so the only way to really become a scientist during that period was to go to medical school. So he did that. He got a medical degree. And then he started out and just decided that he wanted to go out in the field and collect fossils and try to make a living at it. And that led him to the leadership of several surveys. And he ultimately finally took over a survey of his own in the late 1860s. But in this moment, he had to, and many other surveyors, we now have the United States Geological Survey, which kind of organizes all of that kind of work. But in that period, he had to lobby Congress for funding every single year. Wow. So he had to go get money from them, and then he had to go out and do a survey. Then he had to write his reports, and then he had to lobby them again for the next year. So he was extremely talented in all of that. He could lead men, he could write reports, he was a very good scientist, and he could lobby. He was, by all accounts, a sort of charming, aggressive person. And so he did quite well in the lobbying culture. And that really led him to Yellowstone. And he really believed that Yellowstone would make his national and possibly international reputation.
So you mentioned that he was one of the three protagonists of the book. Who are the other two protagonists?
The other two are Jay Cook, who is an investment banker in Philadelphia, who had grown up in Ohio, left school pretty early. He was a mathematical genius. He had an intuitive understanding of business, and he became one of the nation's first investment bankers. This is sort of, I think we tend to think, oh, investment banks have always been with us. But in fact, they emerged in the 1840s and 50s, and Jay Cook was kind of at the forefront of that business. And he made his fortune in the Civil War selling US war bonds to fund the Union war effort. And he was really searching around for a project during Reconstruction to give him that same feeling of patriotism while also making him a boatload of money. And he decided that that project would be the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was meant to be the second transcontinental line. And are we still on?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. I was like, oh no. Okay, we'll cut that part out. So this project was meant to be the second transcontinental line. And Cook really felt that this railroad would make his mark in the same way that Hayden thought that the Yellowstone expedition would make his mark. And Cook was very interested in what Hayden was doing, because he thought that if Hayden found some really great stuff in Yellowstone, that he could bring tourists on his railroad to that region. The line, he wanted it to be built about 50 miles north of Yellowstone. So he was really invested in that project. He faced a lot of opposition, though, from someone he did not anticipate, who was the third protagonist in the book, Tatanka Iyotake, or Sitting Bull, who was the chief of the Hunkpapa Lakota, who controlled lands between the Missouri River and the Yellowstone Basin, just a huge range of land. And Cook wanted to build his railroad right across it, and Sitting Bull was having none of it. So all of those three stories kind of intertwine in this moment in 1871 and 72. And all three of these men were kind of staking their claims to this region at the same time. And this brought them sometimes into accord and sometimes into conflict.
So bottom line, the Native American lost their line. I mean, is that
yes. Ultimately. They did, but one of the, there's a very famous moment in American history in what we term usually the Indian Wars, which is the Battle of Greasy Grass or Little Bighorn in 1876, when Sitting Bull and his Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho allies fought the U.S. Army, defeated them in a really decisive victory, the most decisive victory they had ever had against the U.S. Army. That was 1876. So this is 5 years before that. And in the book, I'm arguing that it's this moment when Sitting Bull starts to fight against the Northern Pacific and to really assert his people's sovereignty and their ownership of that land between the Missouri and Yellowstone, that leads him to that battle in 1876. The sort of road to Little Bighorn starts here. And it was a decisive victory, but in the end, it was a real problem for the Lakota because the U.S. Army then wanted revenge, and ultimately Sitting Bull crossed the border into Canada and stayed there for several years before coming back and surrendering to the U.S. Army in 1881.
Well, here in Canada, our Prime Minister has done a lot of work on trying to compensate Native American for the wrongs of the past. I wonder if something like that have been going on in the United States, compensation or, I don't know, returning of the lands or something of that nature?
There has definitely been the emergence in really the past 5 or 10 years of what is called the land back movement, where Indigenous activists are calling for the government to return lands to Native peoples that they either, outright stole or took in violation of treaties. And there have been calls too for the national government, the federal government, to turn over national parks to Indigenous peoples because they were the original stewards of the land. And we'll see how that goes. I mean, what I think that is interesting is happening is that Yellowstone National Park officials have already announced that in celebration of this 150th anniversary year, they are going to work with the more than 20 Indigenous communities that have ties to Yellowstone. And they are going to work with them on exhibits and demonstrations. And they're also building a Native History Center at Old Faithful, which is the most popular site in Yellowstone. And so that, I think, is moving toward a recognition of the long Indigenous history in the region, and also a kind of reckoning with the history of the park and how what we call America's best idea, the national park system, has rested on native land dispossession.
Wow. I wonder if there is any effect of global warming on Yellowstone Park.
There is, yes. We just actually had a report come out in I think July of 2021 out of Montana State. Yellowstone Basin is at the center of a larger Yellowstone ecosystem, which is one of the most intact temperate zone ecosystems in the world, which makes it just a wonderful place for scientists to do work on climate change. And they have determined that climate change is already affecting Yellowstone. As I mean, I am not sure if you experience this much north of the border, but we have had huge wildfire seasons the last couple of years in the West, creating these huge smoke banks kind of throughout that region. And that will continue to happen as the temperatures get warmer and there are fewer snowstorms, less snowpack, which means more rain, but more evaporation. And in this part of the country, as I imagine also in this part of Canada, water resources are vital. And so Yellowstone Basin actually is the headwaters for the Yellowstone, the Green River, and the Snake River. And all of those rivers kind of branch out and go to the Mississippi, the Columbia, and the Colorado. And this is why actually Ferdinand Hayden called Yellowstone the heart of the continent, because it gave birth to so many rivers. And if that water source begins to decline, which I think it already is, this is going to cause major problems throughout, not only for the ecosystem itself, but also for anyone living in the region. You know, their water resources are going to decline. So that is the pattern we are starting to see. It's going to affect wildlife. It's also going to affect the geysers because they operate with groundwater. If they have less water, it's going to take more time for them to build up that pressure to come out of the ground. So we may start to see that Old Faithful, instead of erupting every 90 minutes, is going to be more like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. So it is serious, and it is happening.
Well, today is the 150th anniversary of this ad. Can you tell us, is there anything going on, any kind of commemoration, celebration event?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the park itself is not open fully right now. And this is an important thing to remember about Yellowstone. In the 1870s and today, the visitation window is really quite narrow. The park is only fully open from kind of mid-May to mid-September. You can still go in the park, you can still cross-country ski and do some things, but only one of the entrances is open, the northern entrance. And so it's much more restricted. So there's really only kind of 4 to 5 months of celebration time in the park. So most of the Yellowstone 150 events are going to start happening actually in May. Although I think, you know, right now they are announcing all kinds of initiatives, again, to work with Indigenous communities and also to bring more kids into the park, more school groups, you know, and really amplify that experience for a lot of Americans and also for visitors from around the world, because you know the pandemic has created an interesting visitation shift. Yellowstone has had, I think, 30% more visitors in the past 2 years than normally because we can't travel internationally. So we are visiting our nation's most iconic spaces without crossing any borders, and Yellowstone is one of them.
Well, we are doing our own celebration of our own by bringing to the market your book. I wonder if we close the interview. Oh, first of all, is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you that you would like to bring up?
No, I think we covered all of the really important aspects of the book. I mean, I think one of the things that readers will enjoy is that there is a lot about photography and painting also in the book. William Henry Jackson and Thomas Moran were on this survey, and they produced some of the most iconic images of Yellowstone ever created. And, you know, visual culture is so important for shaping our ideas of a place. Like you mentioned that you went to Google and you saw pictures of all of these parts of Yellowstone, right? And this is how we see it and we prepare for it before we go there in person. And so the technology of photography and then also the importance of landscape painting, it emerges in the book as Moran and Jackson are two kind of supporting characters in the book. So people who are interested in art and that kind of cultural depiction of natural landscapes, I think will enjoy that aspect of the book.
Well, then the last question is, could you tell us one last time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing?
Oh, sure. Yes. So the book is Saving Yellowstone, Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. And you can find out all about it at my website, which is www.megankatenelson.com. There's a page there for the book. You can find out more about me. You can find out more about my upcoming events in celebration of the book and Yellowstone 150. And you can also click on any of the links to buy the book, either at independent bookstores or any online purveyors. And what I'm really excited about too is the book is available in all formats. So if you like to read hardcover, you can do that. If you'd prefer an ebook, it's available in ebook, and then also audiobook if you would rather listen to the marvelous narrator who's reading the book, Cynthia Farrell, as you're going about your daily routines.
And what about the cover? The cover is very nice.
Yes. So this is the cover is Thomas Moran's painting, his epic painting, The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. So he was with the survey. The book actually depicts Moran's painting of what he called the big picture, which he ultimately sells to Congress in June of 1872 for $10,000. So one of the most expensive paintings of the day, and Congress bought it and hung it in the US Capitol.
Megan, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.